I'm going to go just a little bit longer. And I have to have this conversation. My dad got it going, started last night. Now, let me have a moment, because this is what I said when we did this in February. For people who are watching on YouTube, this is what I say. I just spent an hour with my Baptist and my Methodist neighbors, and now I'm having to get my brain ready to have this conversation. Let me have a little bit of breath, water, look at these folk and tell them, just like I said about my Baptist and my Methodist neighbors, I don't hate any of these people. And I'm not just looking at them as, they are not my competition. And I'm not even thinking anything like that. These are my brethren in Christ. And when you read your New Testament, you find brethren in Christ having to make corrections towards other brethren in Christ. And this is a thing that we all say. Well, it's not just that. I'm saying Terrence Dendy and Phil Sanders, they would say these type of things. It's not just that you need to be ready to rebuke folk. You need to be ready to hear some rebuking. Even King David let himself be rebuked. Nathan came in and said, "You're the man. If a king can be rebuked, then a man in the pew can be rebuked." And we just got all this stuff on and on and on. But then you start trying to actually make some corrections, and people start getting bent out of shape. And people start calling you a Pharisee. And people start calling you holier than thou. And just on and on and on. They take away from your character. Well, why can't I be a good guy and just disagree with you? Why can't I? And it's not that I disagree with these men. They agree with me on paper. They just won't put it into practice. So, let me do this really quick. This is what my dad played last night. This is B.J. Clark. B.J. Clark is the director of the Memphis School of Preaching, and B.J. Clark believes in calling out false teachers' names. Here we go.
Change that would be destructive for generations to come. And so I want to say to all of us here, would you turn to 2 Kings 17? This is where we'll close. I just want to sum up this. This shows just how dangerous one man can be if we allow him to go unchecked. And you could be talking about Max Lucado. And I spoke at a congregation some years ago. They'd invited me for a meeting. I didn't know a whole lot about the church, but I knew what I was going to preach was the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, as God was my helper. I was astonished, I must say, to see that this church that had invited me to come was honoring their graduates and gave them all Max Lucado gift books for their graduation.
Oh, boy. Oh, man. Can you believe they gave him a Max Lucado book? He said, if we don't put these false teachers in check, there's no telling the amount of damage they can do. He said, I was there to teach the whole truth, nothing but the truth, as God is my helper. And he said, I watched them give them Max Lucado books, and he said that was astonishing to him. Well, this information tonight is going to give him a heart attack if giving a Max Lucado book is astonishing. Terrence Dendy and Phil Sanders are coming to Polishing the Pulpit. Here's a website you can check out where Phil Sanders has his own pull-down tab, and you can get information about him. That's called PTPerror.com. Terrence Dendy is the director of the Texas School of Preaching. It's the newest school of preaching. And Phil Sanders is the host of a long-going television broadcast called In Search of the Lord's Way. I have to give you some context of some recent events that are going on. Okay, this is a brother in Christ. His name is Brad Harrop. And recently, 3 young men who work with Brad Harrop, they put out a podcast where they talked about alcohol. And when they got done with the podcast, then Brad even put an extended note behind their podcast. And this was essentially the idea that Brad put out. Brad Harrop said, I don't drink alcohol, but I don't mind if you do so in your home, as long as you do it in your home and you don't get drunk. Brad Harrop does not support social drinking, right? He's not advocating going out to a restaurant. He says it's going to hurt your influence. And that's where then I have to say, if it hurts my influence to drink at the restaurant, I can't imagine it's not going to hurt my influence when people see me walking out the liquor store and walking out of the grocery store with a box of wine in my buggy. But anyway, he says, I don't drink alcohol, but I don't mind if you do, so long as you do it at home and you don't get drunk. Okay, I don't do it, but I don't mind if you do it. And this was Terrence Dendy's response to that. He said, you are a truth-hating, devil-loving, arrogant, change agent, false teacher. You got the adjective down. Like, there's no doubt. There's some adjectives in there. Hey, they went hard on Brad Harrop. Terrence Dendy and the staff at the Texas School of Preaching. They wrote a 19-page document against Brad Harab's podcast. It's like 19 pages, thousands of words. I put into a Word document, 1.5 spacing, Times New Roman, 12 font, 19 pages. Now, here's what's happening when I said Terrence Dendy and Phil Sanders are coming to Polishing the Pulpit. Brad Harab says, I don't drink, but I don't mind if you do, so long as you do it at home and you don't get drunk. And Terrence Dendy's response to that was, you are a truth-hating, devil-loving, arrogant, change agent, false teacher. Well, here comes Phil Sanders. And Phil Sanders, by his actions, is saying, I don't use women preachers, but I don't mind if you do. Silence from Terrence Dendy. Dendy has known this information since February. Now, if you can write a 19-page Word document, surely you could send some information over to GBN, house to house, heart to heart, and whatever Alabama congregation is overseeing Polishing the Pulpit. Surely, if you can write a 19-page paper against Brad Harab, then you can write something to GBN and Polishing the Pulpit that says, look, if you guys have Phil Sanders, you're not having Texas School of Preaching or any of the faculty. I don't use women preachers, but I don't mind if you do. And Terrence Dendy says nothing. Here comes Phil Brookman. He says, it's true. Phil Sanders doesn't use a woman preacher, but doesn't mind if you do. It's true, I shared the Pepperdine pulpit with a woman preacher and then came to preach at the Edmond Church of Christ, which is the home of Phil Sanders' TV show In Search of the Lord Way, and nothing happened. No correction, no reproof, no rebuke. Just let it slide. What does that translate out to? Phil Sanders doesn't do it. He doesn't mind if you do. Silence from the whole PTP lineup. Why does Phil Sanders get to keep coming back to PTP without making any corrections? I'm going to move on. This is not going to take long. Look, did you hear the audio to the beginning of this broadcast? Steve Higginbotham wrote in his book, When the Prodigal is Your Prodigal, and he said, any sin inside of your family that you don't correct, he said, you are complicit to it. You're an enabler. Phil Sanders is an enabler to those who would use women preachers like Phil Brookman. Phil Brookman shares the pulpit at Pepperdine with women preachers. Then he leaves Pepperdine and he comes to preach at Edmond, and Phil Sanders doesn't do a thing about it. And then Terrence Dendy doesn't even correct him for not correcting Phil Brookman. Read your own books. Not saying anything against a sin makes you complicit in their sin with them. You become guilty with them. Goebel Music, Critical Study of a Critical Subject Fellowship. What a Fellowship, 1992, Collierville, Church of Christ Lectures. B.J. Clark is in here teaching guilt by association. Y'all got all kind of guilt by association going on here. Now, you have to say that's what he believes. Just like Brad would say, now, I don't drink. And he doesn't. His kids don't. None of the other men on the podcast do. They don't drink. But they don't mind if you do it in your home so long as you don't get drunk. And to that, Terrence Dendy said, you're a truth-loving, truth-hating, devil-loving, arrogant, change agent, false teacher. But he's totally silent when Phil Sanders acts out. That's my next thing, y'all. He's not even drinking. He has the false teachers coming to the building. Phil Brookman says nothing, has no problem with women preachers. I don't do it, but I don't mind if you do. That's put into action. He comes in, it's true. I shared the Pepperdine pulpit with women preacher and then came to preach at Edmond Church of Christ, the home of Phil Sanders' TV show In Search of the Lord's Way. Terrence Dendy not saying anything. Hey, what you putting it all on Terrence Dendy for? You're right. Cody McCoy not saying anything. Cody McCoy, friend of mine. I'm saying I've stayed in his house, family member's house. His kids have stayed in my parents' house. They've been to all kinds of tent meetings. That's why I say none of this stuff is personal. Cody McCoy not giving anything to Phil Sanders. Aaron Gallagher, nothing to Phil Sanders. How do y'all have Phil Sanders, who is out here saying, I don't use a woman preacher, but I'm fine if y'all do? I'm saying, y'all, with all the schools of preaching that we got, have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather reprove them. Y'all aren't reproving? Y'all are looking at Search for the Lord's Way and say, Search for the Lord's Way been on TV for so long. Mac Line got that going. Now Phil Sanders got it going. It's such a big institution. It's too big to fail. It'd be so heartbreaking for people not to have Phil Sanders on PTP. Yeah, Phil Sanders out here saying to people, I don't use women preachers, but if you use them at home, I don't have a problem with that. 1 Timothy 2:11. Let the woman learn in silence with all subjection. I suffer not a woman to teach nor usurp authority over the man, but to be in silence. Phil Sanders not standing up for that. Neither is Terrence Dendy. As long as he keeps giving a pass to Phil Sanders, y'all aren't standing up for 1 Timothy 2:11 and 12. You're not standing up for 1 Corinthians 14:34. Let me go back and talk about it. You know how big PTP is? They got all kinds of speakers who could say something about Phil Sanders, and they don't, right? Go back to this. You can't even read their books, is what B.J. Clark said.
Nothing. Oh, this shows just how dangerous one man can be if we allow him to go unchecked. And you could be talking about Max Lucado. And I spoke at a congregation some years ago. They'd invited me for a meeting. I didn't know a whole lot about the church, but I knew what I was going to preach was the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, as God was my helper. I was astonished, I must say, to see that this church that had invited me to come was honoring their graduates and gave them all Max Lucado gift books for their graduation.
I was astonished they gave them Max Lucado. You got Pepperdine speakers. Do you know Max Lucado speaks on Pepperdine? You have Pepperdine speakers coming in to where Phil Sanders has his television broadcast, and then Phil Sanders comes over. And B.J. Clark saying, well, I teach the whole truth, nothing but the truth. No. No. You guys are not teaching the truth right now. What y'all are doing is you're condemning the whole world around you and giving a pass to one of your buddies. This is total respect of persons. This is total hypocrisy. B.J. Clark says they gave him a book. I'm going to be quite honest with you. I haven't found too many high school graduates that actually read books, right? Like you're giving these kids a Max Lucado book at graduation time frame, and B.J. Clark has been out of shape about the book. Y'all got Phil Brookman coming to Edmond during a summer youth series. He has no problem with women preachers. He's directing the Memphis School of Preaching. He's directing the Texas School of Preaching, and they're not saying a word. I don't know why y'all are still supporting them. And I have people calling me, young guys calling me, asking me like about schools. I said, they're not going to teach you to do anything except for basically keep their brotherhood politics alive. Memphis School of Preaching makes the students go to the Freed-Hardeman lectures. It's a total political move. On and on and on. Political. See and be seen and flaunt your wares and push your, quote, individual ministry. Now, here's the next group. It's not just Phil Sanders. Phil Sanders says, I don't use women preachers, but I don't mind if you do. Aaron Gallagher, Don Blackwell, B.J. Clark, by their actions are all saying, we don't worship with instrumental music, but we don't care if you do. And Terrence Dendy didn't say anything. The Texas School of Preaching, while it is the newest school of preaching, is promoting themselves as like the soundest school, the toughest school. They call themselves Texas Preachers, and I'm saying, I would assume off of the book, J.D. Tant, Texas Preacher. J.D. Tant was a rough dude. So we're Texas Preachers. They got a hashtag where they say we don't present, we preach. And they got a hashtag where they say we make it plain. Well, how about y'all make it plain on instrumental music and women preachers? We don't worship with musical instruments, but we don't care if you do. Wait a second, Caleb. How can you say that? These men, and they teach on GBN and they direct these schools, how could you possibly say they don't worship with instrumental music, but they don't care if other people do? They let these people come on the lectureship, and they didn't bat an eye, and they didn't say a word. Look at this. This is David Skidmore. My dad had him up on the broadcast recently. Where's he talking? Who's he talking to? David Skidmore, Youth Ministry Network, 2020. David Skidmore. It's still youth ministry, Pepperdine Church Relations. Now, that's David Skidmore. There's Bruce McLarty. He's now the minister in residence at Freed-Hardeman University. He was the past president at Harding, and he's a multiple-time speaker at Pepperdine, where he too shared the pulpit with a woman preacher. These guys don't have a problem with instrumental music. They worship with instrumental music. And then they come and they speak on Freed-Hardeman. And Don Blackwell and B.J. Clark and Aaron Gallagher say nothing. Aaron Gallagher went to Freed-Hardeman and just worked the GBN booth. B.J. Clark shared the pulpit with these men. What's his name? David Skidmore. Winterfest. Now, if you watched my dad's broadcast last night, he played the clip of B.J. Clark saying, he says, it breaks my heart when they take these young people to Jeff Walling's Winterfest, because he's a false teacher. That's what B.J. Clark said. Jeff Walling, there he is. Jeff Walling's Winterfest. Who else is there? David Skidmore, the youth man. David Skidmore goes from Jeff Walling's Winterfest and he comes over to Freed Hardeman. So what B.J. Clark is saying, well, you can't go to Winterfest. But Winterfest can come to Freed Hardeman, it's no problem. And what do they do at Winterfest? Look, y'all, Winterfest has a whole band. And what's that for? Hello? What is Winterfest? Winterfest is a spiritual event for young people. What you got a band for? We don't worship with instrumental music, but we don't care if you do it. That's why all of y'all came down on Brad Harrop, and I don't agree with Brad Harrop's position. But I'm saying, you go out and you write 19 pages of paper against this dude, and you can't say a peep against Phil Sanders saying, I don't use women preachers, but I don't mind if you do. Phil Brookman comes to the Edmond Church of Christ. Let me just say it this way too. Let's switch it up. Any of these men. What would you think about it if these men, Terrence Dendy, Aaron Gallagher, Don Blackwell, B.J. Clark, what would you do if you saw them sharing the pulpit with a woman preacher? And they didn't say anything. Well, right now you're saying, oh, they wouldn't do that. They wouldn't do that. What if they did? You say, well, I wouldn't use them. Well, what are you going to do if they start using people who do share the pulpit with women preachers? Why is that not as much of a problem? This man shares the pulpit with women preachers, and he comes and he preaches at Phil Sanders' home congregation, and you guys don't think that's a problem. And they are coming to Freed Hardeman. He shares the pulpit with women preachers. He goes to Winterfest where there's instrumental music. They're not saying anything. B.J. Clark shared the pulpit with those men and said nothing. Aaron Gallagher said nothing, just worked the GBN booth. And I tell you, what all this boils down to is, look, it's a political realm. Right now, they don't feel like they have to say anything because their youth is at PTP, their youth is at Freed Hardeman, purely out of tradition. We've got these kids whose parents went to Freed Hardeman, whose grandparents went to Freed Hardeman. You know, I got an aunt who went to Freed Hardeman. I got an aunt who went to Freed Hardeman, an aunt who went to Abilene, and an aunt who went to Harding. And you know what? I'd say this to them at the dinner table. I said, y'all didn't learn much over there. I started asking them questions about the Bible department. They didn't remember anything. But that's their tradition, right? That's their tradition, and these people are coming into the Freed Hardeman lectureship purely on tradition. You don't have to educate them, and they're not worried about it. What do you need them? What do you need to educate them for? We just need them to come here and get a 4-year degree. We need them to come through the what are they called? Memphis School of Preaching for 2 years. Take those 2 years worth of credit, go over there and get a 2-year degree from Freed Hardeman. What they do after that is their business. And that's all this is business. What's that going on? That's business. That's advertising at Freed Hardeman lectures while they got 4, Noel Whitlock and Dale Maynor. They had 4 Pepperdine speakers at FHU lectures in 2023 in February. They're not saying anything. And now let's go back to BJ's discussion.
This shows just how dangerous one man can be if we allow him to go unchecked. And you could be talking about Max Lucado. And I spoke at a congregation some years ago. They'd invited me for a meeting. I didn't know a whole lot about the church, but I knew what I was going to preach was the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth as God was my helper. I was astonished, I must say, to see that this church that had invited me to come was honoring their graduates and gave them all Max Lucado gift books for their graduation.
And what do you think BJ did about it? I have to have this moment with you too. He's astonished. It's nothing to go into a congregation and talk about Max Lucado. Max Lucado has been gone since the 90s, right? Everybody knows you're picking like the easiest kid on the playground to beat up. Oh, I went over there and I talked about Max Lucado. When I go preach at congregations, do you know what I do? I preach about the Memphis School of Preaching and how they're not gatekeeping anything. I go and I tell them how Memphis School of Preaching is right in bed with Oklahoma Christian. And Oklahoma Christian, a cappella concerts, well, a cappella Keith Lancaster concerts, right? Stafford North, he has died. Jay Lockhart, I'm telling these people, they're all in business together on your dime. And they're not teaching a thing. You got all these Pepperdine speakers on Freed Hardeman lectures, and they use instrumental music, and the only thing I can take away from that is that Aaron Gallagher, Don Blackwell, B.J. Clark, Terrence Dindy, because if he's not going to correct them, he's in the same boat. We don't worship with instruments, but we don't care if you do. I don't use women preachers, Phil Sanders says, but I don't mind if you do. And here he is. He doesn't have a problem with it. He'll share the pulpit. Now, what do you think they're doing about it? I'll show you out of B.J. Clark's own mouth.
And I was grateful. Later in the week, the elders and I determined I was going to say something in a nice way anyway, but they asked me to come and have a meeting with them. They said, we'd like to ask all of our visiting preachers if they have any insights, anything they'd like to offer or say. And I said, I want to say this in a Christian spirit, but I want to say it with absolute firmness mixed with kindness. Max Lucado is a danger to these young people.
Max Lucado is so dangerous that B.J. Clark waited till days after the fact to have a backroom meeting with the elders. If he's so dangerous, poison, why didn't you say from your pew, hey, can you guys give me like 15 extra minutes tonight so I can tell you why Max Lucado is a false teacher? It's a joke. I'm saying all these schools of preaching, joke. He said, I came in here to teach the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, as God is my helper. And then you wait to get in a back room instead of just standing up and saying, Max Lucado is a false teacher. I don't know why they're giving you those books.
I want to say this in a Christian spirit, but I want to say it with absolute firmness mixed with kindness.
Everybody's just thinking about, how am I going to say this, how am I going to say it? How about you just say it? Because so far, nobody's saying anything. This video is taken from 2015. This book, B.J. Clark is in here teaching Guilt by Association, 1992. He has changed a lot since 1992. B.J. Clark has changed a lot since 2015. Now, I'm just like, the truth is the truth, and folk are going to call me a bad dude, or they're going to call me a bad dude, and they're going to call me whatever they want to call me. So at this point, I'm just giving you the evidence, okay? Here's the evidence. You're going to do what you want to do with it. And this business about these backroom meetings, oh, I'm going to get in touch with so-and-so, and we're going to have a meeting, and then I'm going to get in touch with this guy's cousin, and we're going to have a meeting. What? Y'all are operating on the biggest platforms in the brotherhood, and you can never make a public discussion. Biggest platform in the brotherhood. Biggest preaching school in the brotherhood. Biggest platform in the brotherhood. Well, you got to have a backroom meeting. You ain't going to do nothing. Now, I'm out here, my dad's out here, because, look, someone has got to say something about truth. Someone has got to defend these clear-cut scriptures. And this happened today. I love y'all, okay? I can say that 1,000 times, some people are never going to believe it. So, this happened today. That is South Seminole Church of Christ in Florida. That is their elder/preacher, Gary Summers. This is their assistant preacher, Connor Boyer. He graduated from the East Tennessee School of Preaching. This is one of the men of that congregation who does work with GBN. He makes content for GBN. And I don't know if this was the first year that he went to Polishing the Pulpit, but he and his family were at Polishing the Pulpit this year. This was shown to me. I shared it with my dad. Gary Summers, let me have a moment about Gary Summers. Gary Summers came years ago. This congregation has supported my dad for years. Gary Summers came years ago to Virginia, and he debated Olin Hicks, who teaches that the guilty party can remarry, on and on. And Gary debated Olin Hicks underneath my dad's tent during a tent meeting. I have known Gary since I was 13 years old. My dad's very, very best, one of his best friends, Guy Dickinson, lived and died in the South Seminole congregation. Guy Dickinson supported my dad all through the Pacific. There are other people in that congregation who have supported my dad's evangelistic work for years. And my dad has tried to keep people abreast of the information, and some people just don't look at it. And so he's had conversations with Gary Summers behind the scenes and just showing this information, and I'm saying real, candid, tense conversations. Well, now this is happening. And this happened today. My dad said to Gary Summers, Gary, I hope you are well. I want you to know that I have decided not to receive funds from the congregation's treasury anymore. I will give you a call next week. See, in the political realm, doing business, showing your, quote, ministry at the Freed-Hardeman lectures, even though there's 4 Pepperdine speakers there and you don't make a peep, money, business. All these schools of preaching and the ministries are scared to death that they're going to be cut off and wrote off people's budget sheets. And my dad keeps his principles and his convictions, and he says, keep your money. Does that mean he doesn't love Gary? He's doing this because he loves Gary. Gary Summers comes from a super conservative circle with David Brown and Doug McClish and Daniel Denham and on and on and on. But what they did was they hired an assistant preacher who came from a weak modern preaching school, East Tennessee, and they start getting in bed with GBN. Next thing you know, you're at PTP and you're there with Phil Sanders, who says, I don't use women preachers, but I don't mind if you do. I'm done. My dad's money is where his mouth is. And Jesus said in Matthew 6:21, your heart is where your money is. My dad just volunteered to lose at least $500 a month. Your heart is where your money is. Any one of you, number of you, could help Johnny Robertson put that back into the What Does the Bible Say Virginia missions budget. A friend of mine who is a preacher, and he's not inside of the political circles. He's just a dude, child of God, and he's out there doing his own thing. He didn't go to school. He's not with any of these schools. A lot of his friends are, and he said this to me one time. He said, Caleb, he said, we talk about you, my friends and I. And he said, and we talk about how you're out there, and you're taking the blows. And he said, and we let you. Based on conviction, instead of operating on fear that we're going to be written out of the budget, look, my conscience, I can't take money from a congregation that's not going to be in the fight. They're actually fighting against what I'm trying to accomplish. And this is where I say to everybody right now, you talk about, well, we appreciate Johnny Robertson. We appreciate what does the Bible say. Well, if that's true, stop being a spectator and get into the fight. What could you do? Why are you not calling Memphis School of Preaching, sending mail, sending email? You can get online and find this stuff out. Contact Memphis School of Preaching, contact GBN, contact House to House, Heart to Heart. Contact these people, put mail on their desk, call them up, put emails in their inbox, and put some pressure on these people. Because right now the political spectrum is absolutely tanking the church. Pepperdine's coming in, Winterfest is coming in. And what are y'all doing about it? Nothing. I love you. I'd do this. I'd be an absolute hypocrite, y'all, if I went so hard on Baptists and Methodists and then saw this going on with my own brethren and didn't say anything. I love you. Good night. God bless you. Keep asking, what does the Bible say?